The lightning split the Wyoming sky like a jagged knife, illuminating the prairie in bursts of white terror as Lila Zimmerman whipped the reins against the flanks of her wagon horses, knowing with cold certainty she would not make it to White River before the storm devoured her whole. The wind had risen from nothing to a howling monster in minutes, tearing at her bonnet and ripping it from her head, sending her dark hair streaming behind her like a war banner. The horses screamed their fear, eyes rolling white in the darkness between lightning strikes, and Lila felt the wagon lurch sickeningly to one side as the left wheel struck something hard in the tall grass. She had left Fort Laramie 3 days ago with a merchant caravan, but when her uncle had taken ill with fever at their last stop, the others had pushed ahead, promising to send help back from White River. That help had not come, and her uncle had died yesterday morning, his body wrapped in canvas and tied to the back of the wagon because the ground was too hard to dig, and Lila had no shovel strong enough for the task. Now she was alone in a storm that seemed intent on killing her, and she realized with a strange calm that she might die out here. 23 years old and unmarried, her entire life reduced to a pile of bones scattered across the Wyoming territory. The rain came then, not gradually but all at once, a solid wall of water that turned the world into a gray blur. Lila could barely see the horses, could not see the ground, could not tell if she was still on any kind of trail, or if they had veered off into empty prairie where she would wander until the horses dropped dead, and she followed soon after. The wagon tipped again, harder this time, and Lila heard the crack of wood splitting. She tried to pull the horses to a stop, but they were beyond her control now, driven by blind panic, running from the thunder that crashed overhead like artillery fire. She braced herself against the seat, her hands aching from gripping the reins, her dress soaked through and plastered to her skin, the cold seeping into her bones. Then she saw him, or thought she saw him, a dark figure on horseback emerging from the rain like a ghost, riding alongside her wagon. She blinked water from her eyes, certain she was imagining things, but he was still there, moving closer, and she could see he was a man in a long coat, his hat pulled low against the storm. He was shouting something, but the wind tore his words away, and Lila shook her head, unable to understand. He pointed ahead and to the left, gesturing urgently, and Lila tried to follow his direction, pulling on the left rein with all her strength. The horses fought her, but the man rode ahead of them, cutting in front, forcing them to turn. Lila held on as the wagon careened across the rough ground, bouncing so hard she bit her tongue and tasted blood. The man stayed ahead of them, guiding them, and after what felt like hours but could only have been minutes, Lila saw a dark shape looming out of the rain, a building of some kind, and the man was directing her toward it. They reached what appeared to be a barn, and the man dismounted in one smooth motion, running to the horses' heads and grabbing their harnesses, pulling them to a stop. Lila sat frozen for a moment, her hands locked around the reins, her whole body shaking. The man secured the horses to a post and then came to the side of the wagon, reaching up for her. "Come down," he shouted over the storm. "You cannot stay out here." Lila tried to move but found her legs would not obey. The man did not wait for her to figure it out. He reached up and lifted her bodily from the wagon seat, setting her on her feet. Her legs buckled immediately and he caught her, his arm around her waist. "Can you walk?" he asked, and Lila nodded, though she was not sure it was true. He half carried her to a small door set into the side of the barn, pushed it open, and brought her inside. The sudden absence of wind and rain was shocking, and Lila stood dripping on the dirt floor, shivering so hard her teeth chattered. The man left her for a moment and returned with a blanket which he wrapped around her shoulders. "There is a house," he said, his voice rough and low. 50 yards that way. But the worst of the storm needs to pass before we run for it. You will freeze in those wet clothes." Lila looked at him properly for the first time. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that put him somewhere in his late 20s. His eyes were a startling blue-green, the color of deep water, and his dark hair was plastered to his head from the rain. He wore the clothes of a working ranch hand, sturdy and practical, and he moved with the easy confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing in any situation. "Thank you," Lila managed through chattering teeth. "I thought I was going to die out there." "You might have," the man said bluntly. "This is no storm to be caught in alone. What were you thinking, traveling by yourself?" "I was not alone," Lila said, stung by his tone despite knowing he was right. "My uncle was with me, but he died. Yesterday. He is still in the wagon." The man's expression softened slightly. "I am sorry. That is hard. We were going to White River," Lila continued, needing to explain, needing him to understand she was not a complete fool. "We got separated from our caravan when he took sick. They were supposed to send help back, but no one came." The man's jaw tightened. Bill Morrison's caravan. Short man, gray beard, always talking about his good Christian values. "Yes," Lila said, surprised. "You know him." "I know him," the man said, and there was enough contempt in his voice to fill a church. "He would not send help back if his own mother was dying on the trail. He cares about two things, his schedule and his profit. Everything else can go hang." Lila felt a flare of anger at Morrison for abandoning them, but she was too cold and exhausted to sustain it. The man seemed to notice because he moved to a corner of the barn and began rummaging through a pile of supplies. "I have some dry clothes here," he said. "They will be too big for you, but better than freezing. There is a stall in the back corner. You can change there." He tossed her a bundle, and Lila caught it reflexively. The clothes were indeed far too large, a man's work shirt and trousers, but they were dry, and that was all that mattered. She went to the stall he had indicated and changed quickly, her fingers clumsy with cold. When she emerged, the man had started a small fire in a metal brazier, and the warmth of it drew her like a magnet. "My name is Lila Zimmerman," she said, settling near the fire and holding her hands toward the flames. "From Pennsylvania originally. My uncle and I were headed west to meet my brother in California." "Kade Rourke," the man said. "This is my land, my house and barn such as they are." "I am sorry for trespassing," Lila said quickly. "We had no idea where we were. I could not see anything in the storm." "You did not trespass on purpose," Kade said, "and I would not leave anyone out in weather like this, invited or not." He paused, feeding another piece of wood into the fire. "When did you last eat?" Lila tried to remember. "Yesterday morning, I think. Maybe the morning before." "Time has gotten confused." Kade went back to his supplies and returned with a canteen and some dried meat wrapped in cloth. "It is not much, but it will keep you going." Lila took the food gratefully and ate slowly, forcing herself not to devour it like an animal despite her hunger. The water from the canteen was cool and clean, and she drank deeply. Kade settled on the other side of the fire, his eyes distant, watching the flames. "How long have you been out here?" Lila asked, more to break the silence than because she needed to know. 5 years, Kade said. "Bought this land with money I saved working cattle drives. Built the house myself. The barn was already here, half falling down. I fixed it up." "Do you run cattle?" "Some. Mostly I break horses. People bring me their wild ones and I gentle them. Or I buy Mustangs off the range and sell them once they are trained." "That sounds dangerous," Lila said. Kade's mouth quirked in something that was not quite a smile. "It can be, but I am good at it, and I like the work. Horses make more sense than people most of the time." Lila thought about that. You live out here alone? Yes. Do you not get lonely? Kade looked at her then, really looked at her, and Lila felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. Sometimes, he said quietly, but lonely is better than some alternatives. Before Lila could ask what he meant, the barn door rattled in a gust of wind so strong it seemed the whole building might lift off the ground. Kade stood immediately, checking the door's latch and looking out through a gap in the boards. "It is getting worse," he said. "We need to get to the house." "The barn might not hold if this keeps up." "What about the horses?" Lila asked, alarmed. "They will be all right here. The barn has stood through storms before, but we will be safer in the house. It is built into a hillside, protected on 3 sides." He turned to her. "Can you run?" Lila stood, testing her legs. They felt more solid now, warmed by the fire and steadied by food. "Yes." "Then we go now while there is a break in the lightning. Stay close to me. If you fall, I will come back for you, but it is better if you do not fall." He opened the door, and the wind immediately tried to rip it from his hands. Kade held it steady, grabbed Lila's hand with his free one, and pulled her out into the storm. The rain hit her like a fist, and the wind tried to tear her away from Kade, but his grip was iron strong and he did not let go. They ran across the muddy ground, Lila's feet slipping and sliding, and she could barely see where they were going. Lightning flashed, and she caught a glimpse of a low stone building built against the side of a hill, exactly as Kade had described. They reached the door and Kade shoved it open, pulling Lila inside and slamming it shut behind them. Lila stood gasping, dripping yet again, but this time onto a wooden floor instead of dirt. Kade lit a lamp on a table near the door, and warm light filled the space. The house was small but solidly built, one large room with a fireplace at one end, a bed in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, shelves along the walls holding supplies and books. It was spare but clean, the home of a man who lived alone but took pride in his space. "There is more dry clothes in the trunk by the bed," Kade said, already moving to build a fire in the fireplace. "Help yourself. I will heat water so you can wash if you want." Lila found another shirt and a pair of long underwear in the trunk, both well worn but clean. She changed behind a screen in the corner, hanging the wet clothes over the top to dry. When she emerged, Kade had a good fire going and had hung a pot of water over it to heat. "You have been very kind," Lila said. "I do not know how to thank you." "You do not need to thank me," Kade said. "Any decent person would have done the same." "I am not so sure about that," Lila said, thinking of Morrison and his caravan leaving her behind. "Not everyone is decent." Kade looked at her, and for the first time she saw something like approval in his eyes. "No," he agreed, "they are not. But you deserved better than to be left to die on the prairie." The storm raged outside, but inside Kade's house it was warm and safe, and Lila felt the tension she had been carrying for days begin to drain away. She was still worried about what would happen next, about her uncle's body in the wagon, about how she would get to California, but for the moment she was alive, and that was enough. Kade heated the water and poured it into a basin for her, then turned his back politely while she washed her face and hands. When she was done, he did the same, scrubbing away the grime of the storm. Lila found herself watching the way he moved, economical and precise, no wasted motion. He was not a handsome man in the conventional sense, his face too hard and weathered for that, but there was something compelling about him, a quiet strength that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since her father died 2 years ago. "You can take the bed," Kade said when he was done washing. "I will sleep on the floor." "I cannot take your bed," Lila protested. "You have already done so much. You have been through more than I have today," Kade said in a tone that suggested the matter was not open for discussion. "Take the bed. I have slept on worse than a floor." Too tired to argue further, Lila climbed into the bed, which was surprisingly comfortable, the mattress stuffed with something soft, the blankets thick and warm. Kade banked the fire and lay down on the floor near it, using his saddle as a pillow and covering himself with a spare blanket. "Kade," Lila said into the darkness. "Yes. Why do you live out here alone?" There was a long silence, and Lila thought he might not answer. Then his voice came, low and rough. "I was a soldier once, fought in the war. When it was over, I could not go back to the life I had before. Could not live in towns, could not be around people. Everything felt wrong, too loud, too close. So I came out here where it is quiet and there is space to breathe." "The war," Lila repeated softly. She had been barely 13 when it ended, but she remembered the men who came back, how some of them were changed in ways that went deeper than scars. "Yes." "Do you regret it, coming out here?" Another pause. "No, it has been a good life in its way, simple, honest, but sometimes I wonder if I am just hiding instead of living." Lila thought about what he had said earlier, about being lonely but preferring it to the alternatives. "I think you are living," she said. "Maybe not the life others think you should have, but that does not make it less real." She heard him shift in the darkness. "What about you? Why California?" "My brother went there 3 years ago to look for gold. He found some, enough to buy a piece of land and start a farm. He wrote to my uncle and me, said there was opportunity if we were willing to work for it. After my father died, Pennsylvania held nothing for us, so we decided to try our luck in California." "And now your uncle is gone too," Kade said quietly. "Yes." Lila felt the grief rise in her throat but swallowed it down. She had not had time to properly mourn, had been too focused on surviving. "He was a good man. He deserved better than to die on the trail and be left wrapped in canvas. We will bury him properly tomorrow," Kade said. "When the storm passes, I have a shovel that can handle the ground and we can choose a good spot." The kindness in his words broke something loose in Lila's chest, and she felt tears slide down her cheeks in the darkness. She cried silently, not wanting to wake Kade, grieving for her uncle and her father before him, for everything she had lost and everything she had yet to lose. Eventually, exhaustion pulled her under and she slept. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee and bacon. Kade was at the stove, cooking breakfast, and he glanced at her when she stirred. "The storm passed around dawn," he said. "I already checked the barn. The horses are fine and your wagon made it through with only minor damage. I can fix the wheel that was cracked." Lila sat up, pushing her hair out of her face. "You have done so much already, I cannot ask you to fix my wagon too." "You did not ask," Kade said. "I offered, and it is not a big job. I can have it done by this afternoon." He brought her a plate of food and a cup of coffee, and Lila ate hungrily. The food was simple but good, and she felt strength returning to her body with every bite. When they were done eating, Kade went out to check her uncle's body and confirmed it was still secure in the wagon. Then he hitched up his own horse and led Lila to a spot on a rise overlooking his land, where wildflowers grew in the spring and the view stretched for miles. "This is a good place," he said, "if it suits you." Lila looked around at the endless sky, the rolling prairie, the distant mountains purple on the horizon. Her uncle would have liked it here, would have appreciated the beauty and the peace. "Yes," she said, "it suits." They spent the morning digging, Kade doing most of the heavy work while Lila helped where she could. When the grave was ready, Kade carefully lowered her uncle's body into it, and Lila said a prayer over him, her voice breaking only once. They filled in the grave together and marked it with a cross Kade made from 2 pieces of wood lashed together with rawhide. "Thank you," Lila said when it was done, "for giving him dignity." "It was the right thing to do," Kade said simply. They walked back to the house in silence, and Lila felt the weight of loss settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She had no family left now except her brother, who was 1,000 miles away in California. She was alone in a way she had never been before. Kade spent the afternoon working on her wagon wheel while Lila washed her own clothes and hung them to dry. She also cleaned up the house a bit, not because Kade had asked her to, but because she needed something to do with her hands. When her clothes were dry, she changed back into her dress, which felt strange and confining after wearing Kade's comfortable work clothes. By evening, the wagon was repaired and ready to travel. Kade had also checked her supplies and replenished what he could from his own stores. Lila stood looking at the wagon and the horses and felt a strange reluctance to leave. "How far is White River?" she asked. "About 15 miles northeast," Kade said. "You could make it by tomorrow evening if you start at first light. The trail is clear from here, easy to follow." Lila nodded. That was good news. She could resupply in White River and ask about joining another caravan heading west. With luck, she could still reach California before winter. But the thought of leaving this place, leaving Kade, filled her with unexpected sadness. "You should stay tonight," Kade said, as if reading her thoughts. "Get a good rest before you travel. No sense pushing yourself when you are still recovering from the storm." Lila agreed, grateful for the reprieve. They ate dinner together, venison stew that Kade had prepared, and talked more easily than they had the night before. Lila told him about Pennsylvania, about her father's small printing business, and how she had learned to set type and run the press. Kade told her about breaking horses, about the satisfaction of taking something wild and fierce and teaching it to trust. "It is not about breaking their spirit," he explained. "It is about forming a partnership. The horse has to want to work with you. If you force it, you end up with an animal that will turn on you the first chance it gets." "Like people," Lila said. Kade looked at her with something like surprise. "Yes, like people." That night, Lila again took the bed while Kade slept on the floor, but this time she lay awake for a long time, listening to his breathing, thinking about what it would be like to stay here instead of moving on. The thought was foolish, she knew. She had known this man for barely 2 days. But there was something about him that called to her, a kindness beneath the rough exterior, a loneliness that matched her own. In the morning, Kade helped her hitch the horses to the wagon and loaded her supplies. The sun was bright, the air clean and fresh after the storm, perfect traveling weather. Lila climbed onto the wagon seat and took up the reins, and Kade stepped back. "Thank you for everything," Lila said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "You saved my life." "Travel safe," Kade said. "And watch out for Morrison if you see him in White River. Do not trust anything he says." Lila nodded, but she could not make herself signal the horses to start moving. She sat there, looking down at Kade, and saw her own reluctance reflected in his eyes. He did not want her to go either. The realization sent a shock through her system. "Kade," she said slowly, "what if I did not go to White River? What if I stayed here instead?" The words hung in the air between them, bold and terrifying. Kade stared up at her, his expression unreadable. "You do not know what you are saying," he finally said. "You have a brother waiting for you in California. You have a life planned out." "I have a brother who I have not seen in 3 years, Lila countered, "who may or may not even remember he invited me. And as for a life planned out, all my plans died with my uncle. I am alone now and I have to make new plans." She took a breath, gathering her courage. "I could make them here if you would let me, Lila." Kade's voice was rough. "You deserve better than a broken-down soldier hiding in the wilderness." "You are not broken down," Lila said fiercely. "And you are not hiding. You are living the life you chose, and I would like to be part of it if you will have me." Kade closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, they were bright with something that might have been hope. "I am not an easy man to live with," he said. "I have nightmares. Sometimes I need to be alone. I am set in my ways. I am stubborn and opinionated, and I will not be ordered about," Lila shot back. "And I snore sometimes. And I cannot cook anything more complicated than stew, so we are both difficult." Despite himself, Kade laughed, and the sound transformed his face, making him look younger, lighter. "You are serious about this?" "I have never been more serious about anything in my life," Lila said. Kade reached up and offered her his hand. Lila took it and climbed down from the wagon, and when her feet hit the ground, Kade did not let go. He looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for doubt or hesitation, and apparently finding none. "Then stay," he said quietly. "Stay and we will figure out the rest as we go." Lila felt a smile spread across her face, wide and genuine, the first truly happy smile she had smiled in longer than she could remember. "Yes," she said, "I will stay." The days that followed were some of the strangest and most wonderful of Lila's life. She and Kade moved around each other carefully at first, learning each other's rhythms and habits. Lila took over the cooking, which was fortunate because Kade's skills in that area extended only to basic survival food. She also helped with the horses, learning how to feed and groom them, watching in fascination as Kade worked with the wild ones, patient and gentle, never raising his voice or his hand in anger. In turn, Kade taught her to ride properly, not the side-saddle nonsense she had learned back east, but real riding, astride and in control. He taught her to shoot, both rifle and pistol, saying that anyone living on the frontier needed to know how to protect themselves. Lila proved a quick study, her hands steady and her eyes sharp. They talked more as the days passed, sharing stories of their lives before this moment. Kade told her about growing up in Missouri, about joining the army at 17 because it seemed like an adventure, about the things he had seen and done during the war that still haunted him. Lila listened without judgment, holding his hand when the memories became too much, offering comfort by her presence alone. Lila told him about her mother's death when she was young, about taking over the household for her father, about the quiet sadness that had pervaded their home after the war when so many of their neighbors' sons had not come back. She told him about the relief she had felt when her uncle suggested moving west, the sense that maybe somewhere new she could be someone different, someone less burdened by grief. "And have you?" Kade asked one evening as they sat watching the sunset from the porch he had built onto the front of the house. "Become someone different," Lila thought about it. "No," she said slowly, "not different, but maybe more myself. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Kade said, and he took her hand and held it, and Lila felt her heart expand in her chest. 3 weeks after Lila had arrived, Kade rode to White River to purchase supplies. He was gone for 2 days, and Lila found she missed him terribly, the house empty and quiet without his steady presence. When he returned, he brought not just supplies but also news. "Morrison's caravan got hit by Sioux raiders about 50 miles west of here," Kade said as he unloaded sacks of flour and coffee. 3 people killed, most of their goods stolen. Morrison himself took an arrow in the leg. They limped back to White River and he is holed up there, complaining to anyone who will listen about the savages. Lila felt a chill run down her spine. "That could have been us," she said quietly. "If my uncle had not gotten sick, if we had stayed with the caravan." "Maybe," Kade said. "Or maybe the raiders would not have attacked if the caravan had been larger." Morrison insisted on moving fast with a small group against all advice. His greed caught up to him. "Is he all right?" "Morrison, he will live, though he will limp for the rest of his days." The doctor in White River says the arrow went clean through. Missed the bone. Kade also brought news that a circuit preacher would be coming through White River in 2 weeks, holding services and performing marriages for anyone who wanted them. He mentioned this casually while putting away supplies, but Lila saw the way he watched her from the corner of his eye, gauging her reaction. "A preacher," Lila said, her heart suddenly beating faster. "That is good news for the town, I suppose." "Yes," Kade said. He paused in his work, then turned to face her fully. "Lila, I know we have not talked about this directly, but I need to know. Do you see this as permanent, us, I mean? Or are you just staying until you figure out what to do next?" Lila set down the coffee tin she was holding and crossed to where Kade stood. She took both his hands in hers and looked up into his face, into those blue-green eyes that had become so dear to her. "I see this as permanent," she said clearly. "I want to build a life here with you if you want the same thing." Kade's hands tightened on hers. "I want that more than anything, but I need to be sure you understand what you are choosing. This is a hard life, Lila. We are miles from town, from other people. The winters are brutal. We will be alone most of the time." "I will have you," Lila said. "That is all I need." Kade pulled her into his arms then, holding her close, and Lila rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. "When the preacher comes," Kade said into her hair, "will you marry me?" "Yes," Lila said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They rode to White River together 2 weeks later, Lila on a gentle mare Kade had trained for her, Kade on his big roan gelding. The journey took most of a day, and Lila marveled at how much her life had changed since the last time she had been on this trail, terrified and alone in the storm. Now she felt strong and capable, confident in her ability to handle whatever came. White River was a small town, just a main street with a general store, a saloon, a boarding house, and a handful of other buildings. The people there knew Kade and greeted him with a mix of respect and curiosity, their eyes sliding to Lila with open interest. Kade introduced her as his intended, and Lila saw approval in most faces, though a few of the women looked disappointed, as if they had harbored hopes of catching Kade themselves. The preacher was a thin man with kind eyes, and he agreed to marry them the next day. Lila used some of her remaining money to buy fabric and spent the evening in the boarding house sewing herself a new dress, something pretty and suitable for a wedding. The boarding house owner's wife, a cheerful woman named Martha, helped her with the more complicated stitching and insisted on lending Lila a veil that had belonged to her own daughter. The wedding took place in the morning outside the general store, with half the town gathered to watch. Lila wore her new dress, pale blue cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs, and Kade wore a clean shirt and his best trousers, his hair neatly combed. They stood before the preacher and spoke their vows clearly, Kade's hand steady as he slipped a simple gold band onto Lila's finger, a ring he had purchased from the general store the day before. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Kade kissed Lila in front of everyone, and the crowd cheered. It was not the grand wedding Lila had sometimes imagined as a girl, but it was perfect in its simplicity. And when she looked into Kade's eyes and saw the love there, she knew she had made the right choice. They stayed in town that night, in the boarding house's best room, and Lila discovered that Kade was as gentle and patient in love as he was with his horses. He made her feel cherished and desired, and when she fell asleep in his arms, she felt more at peace than she had in years. They returned to the ranch the next day, and life settled into a new rhythm. Lila was no longer a guest but a partner, and she threw herself into making the house a true home. She sewed curtains for the windows and a new quilt for their bed. She planted a garden near the house, coaxing vegetables from the stubborn Wyoming soil. She learned to make bread that did not turn out like rocks and to preserve meat for the winter. Kade built her a chicken coop and bought her a dozen hens, and Lila took fierce pride in collecting eggs each morning. He also started work on an addition to the house, a second room that could serve as a workroom for Lila or, someday, a nursery. They did not speak of children yet, but the possibility hung in the air between them, sweet and full of promise. Summer faded into autumn, and the prairie turned gold and rust. Kade brought in the last of the hay and made sure the barn was tight and secure for winter. Lila harvested her garden and stored everything carefully, determined that they would eat well even in the coldest months. One evening in late October, as they sat by the fire after supper, Kade seemed unusually quiet. Lila had learned to recognize his moods, to know when he needed space and when he needed her close. Tonight felt like the latter, so she moved to sit beside him on the floor, leaning against his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "About how different my life is now," Kade said. 6 months ago I was alone. I woke up alone, ate alone, worked alone, slept alone. I told myself I was content with that, and maybe I was in a way, but it was a gray kind of contentment, not real happiness. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were bright in the firelight. "You brought color back into my world, Lila. You made me remember what it feels like to be truly alive." Lila felt tears prick at her eyes. "You saved me from the storm," she said, "but I think you have saved me in other ways too. I was so lost after my father died, just going through the motions. Coming here, being with you, it is like I woke up from a long sleep." Kade cupped her face in his hands and kissed her tenderly. "I love you," he said. "I should have said it before now, but I am saying it now. I love you more than I knew it was possible to love another person." "I love you too," Lila whispered, "so very much." They made love that night with a new intensity, a new depth of feeling, and afterward Lila lay in Kade's arms and thought about how strange and wonderful life was, how a terrible storm had led her to the one place she was meant to be. Winter came hard and fast, with snow that piled up to the windows and winds that howled like wolves. But inside their house, Lila and Kade were warm and safe. They spent the long, dark evenings reading aloud to each other from the small collection of books Kade owned, or playing cards, or simply talking. Lila learned that Kade had a dry sense of humor that could make her laugh until her sides hurt. Kade discovered that Lila could do impressions of people that were wickedly accurate, and she entertained him with renditions of Morrison the Merchant and Martha from the boarding house. When the nightmares came, as they still did sometimes, Lila held Kade and spoke to him softly until he calmed. When Lila woke crying from dreams of her father and uncle, Kade was there, solid and real, reminding her that she was not alone. In February, Lila realized she was pregnant. She waited a few weeks to be sure before telling Kade, and when she finally did, she saw joy and terror flash across his face in equal measure. "Are you frightened?" she asked. "Terrified," Kade admitted. "I never thought I would be a father. I do not know if I will be any good at it." "I am frightened too," Lila confessed, "but I think we will figure it out together just like we have figured out everything else." Kade pulled her close and rested his hand on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby." Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it was glorious. The prairie burst into bloom, carpeted with wildflowers in every color imaginable. Lila's pregnancy progressed smoothly, and she remained active and healthy, continuing to help with the lighter work around the ranch even as her belly swelled. In early May, a young couple arrived at the ranch, having heard through the White River grapevine that Kade Rourke might have work. The man, Daniel, was a good hand with horses, and his wife, Claire, was heavily pregnant herself and looking for a safe place to have her baby. Kade and Lila agreed to let them stay in the barn temporarily, with the understanding that Daniel would help with the work, and they would all figure out a more permanent arrangement after the babies were born. Having another couple around proved to be a blessing. Claire and Lila became fast friends, and it was comforting to have another woman to talk to, someone who understood the mixture of excitement and fear that came with expecting a first child. Daniel proved to be as good as his word, hardworking and eager to learn, and he and Kade got along well. Claire's baby came first, a healthy boy they named Thomas. Lila helped with the birth, and the experience both terrified and reassured her. It was hard and painful, but Claire came through it strong, and little Thomas was perfect. Lila's own time came in late June, on a hot day when the sky was impossibly blue. Kade rode to White River to fetch Martha, who had experience with birthing babies, and the older woman arrived in time to help Lila through the worst of it. Claire stayed nearby, having left Thomas with Daniel, offering encouragement and support. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Lila thought she could not continue, that the pain would break her. But Kade stayed with her the whole time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool water, whispering words of love and strength. And finally, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, their son was born. He was small and red and screaming, absolutely perfect. Kade held him with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face, and Lila watched her strong, stoic husband become completely undone by the sight of his child. "What should we name him?" Kade asked when he could speak. Lila thought about her father, about her uncle, about all the people she had loved and lost. But this was not a time for looking back. This was about the future. "Samuel," she said. "Samuel Rourke, for no one in particular, just because I like the name." "Samuel," Kade repeated, testing it out. "Yes, that is good." The weeks after Samuel's birth were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Lila learned to function on very little sleep, to feed the baby and change him and comfort him when he cried. Kade proved to be a devoted father, taking his turn walking Samuel when he was fussy, singing old songs to him in a surprisingly good voice. Daniel and Claire moved into a small cabin on the far side of Kade's property, and Daniel became Kade's full partner in the horse business. With two men working, they were able to take on more clients, and the ranch began to prosper in a way it had not before. Claire and Lila continued to help each other with the babies and the endless work of running a frontier household. The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the steady growth of their small community. When Samuel was 2, Lila gave birth to a daughter they named Emma, a quiet, serious baby who rarely cried but observed everything with wide, thoughtful eyes. 2 years after that came another son, James, who was loud and energetic from the moment he entered the world. Kade proved to be a wonderful father, patient and loving, teaching his children about horses and the land, instilling in them a respect for all living things. Lila taught them to read and write, using the books from Kade's collection and others they acquired on trips to town. She also taught them about kindness and courage, about standing up for what was right even when it was hard. The ranch continued to grow. Kade and Daniel built more corrals and another barn. They hired another hand, a quiet man named Joseph, who had a gift for working with the most difficult horses. Lila's garden expanded until it produced more than enough vegetables for both families, and she learned to trade the surplus in White River for things they could not make themselves. Life was not always easy. There were droughts and harsh winters, times when money was tight and they had to be careful with every penny. There were losses too. Daniel and Claire's second baby, a daughter, lived only 3 days. Kade's old war injuries sometimes flared up, leaving him in pain for days at a time. And there were still nights when the nightmares came, when Kade woke gasping and Lila had to remind him where he was, who he was now. But through it all, there was love. The deep, abiding love between Kade and Lila that had started in a storm and grown stronger with each passing year. The fierce love they had for their children, and the children had for them and each other. The love of good friends and honest work in a land that, though harsh, provided for those willing to work with it rather than against it. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Kade took Lila back to the spot where they had buried her uncle. The wooden cross had weathered over the years but still stood, and wildflowers grew thick around the grave. Kade had carved a proper headstone from a piece of granite, and he and Daniel had set it in place the week before as a surprise for Lila. "I wanted you to see it," Kade said as they stood hand in hand looking at the stone. "I wanted him to be properly remembered." Lila read the inscription through tears. Benjamin Zimmerman, 1809–1874, a good man who brought his niece safely to where she needed to be. "Thank you," she whispered, turning to Kade. "Thank you for this and for everything." "You saved me," Kade said quietly. "I was half dead when you came into my life, just going through the motions. You made me want to live again, really live. You gave me a reason to face each day with hope instead of just grim determination. And you saved me from the storm," Lila said. "But more than that, you gave me a home, a real home. You gave me love and family and purpose. We saved each other." Kade kissed her then, standing in the prairie grass with the wind in their hair and the sun warm on their faces. And Lila thought about the girl she had been 10 years ago, terrified and alone in the storm, thinking she was going to die. That girl could never have imagined this life, this love, this profound contentment. They walked back to the house hand in hand, and from a distance they could see their children playing in the yard, Samuel helping Emma climb a tree while James dug in the dirt with a stick. Smoke rose from the chimney of Daniel and Claire's cabin, and the horses grazed peacefully in the pasture. It was a good life, Lila thought. A life built on hard work and determination and love. Not the life she had planned, perhaps, but so much better than anything she could have planned. The storm that had nearly killed her had brought her to exactly where she was meant to be, to the man she was meant to love, to the family she was meant to build. That night, after the children were asleep, Lila and Kade sat on their porch watching the stars come out one by one. Kade had his arm around Lila and she leaned against his shoulder, perfectly content. "You ever wonder what your life would have been like if the storm had not driven you here?" Kade asked. Lila considered the question. "Sometimes. I suppose I would have made it to California eventually, would have lived with my brother and his family. Maybe I would have married someone there, or maybe I would have stayed a spinster aunt helping to raise my nieces and nephews. It would have been a fine life, probably." "But," Kade prompted. "But it would not have been this life," Lila said. "It would not have been you, and I cannot imagine anything that would be worth more than what we have here." "I think about it too," Kade admitted. "About what my life would have been if I had not gone out in that storm, if I had stayed in the house and let you pass by. I would have gone on alone, getting older and harder and more set in my ways, until I became one of those bitter old men who trust nothing and no one. The ranch would have stayed small, just me and my horses, just surviving day to day." "But instead you went out in the storm," Lila said. "Instead I went out in the storm," Kade agreed, "and found everything I did not know I was missing." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the prairie, the chorus of crickets and the distant howl of coyotes. Inside the house, one of the children cried out briefly in their sleep, then settled again. I am pregnant again, Lila said suddenly and felt Kade stiffen in surprise. You are certain? Yes. I have suspected for a few weeks, but I wanted to be sure before I told you. Kade was quiet for a moment, processing the news. Then he laughed, a sound of pure joy. 4 children. We are going to have 4 children. Are you happy about it? Lila asked, though she could hear the answer in his laughter. I am terrified and exhausted just thinking about it, Kade said. And yes, I am happy, so very happy. This 4th pregnancy was harder than the others, and Lila was grateful that she now had help from Claire and from Anna, the wife of Joseph, the hired hand. The women formed a tight support system, helping each other with childcare and household tasks, trading skills and knowledge. In early spring, with the prairie just beginning to turn green, Lila gave birth to twin girls. The labor was swift and intense, and when Martha announced that there was a second baby coming, Lila was too tired to be surprised. The girls were tiny but healthy, mirror images of each other, and Kade suggested naming them Rose and Lily after the wildflowers that would soon cover the prairie. With 5 children, the house that had once seemed adequate was now bursting at the seams. Kade and Daniel spent the summer building a true addition, 3 new rooms that gave the older children their own space and provided a proper workroom for Lila. Joseph helped when he could, and even young Samuel, now 8 years old, did his part carrying tools and cleaning up scraps of wood. The addition was finished by autumn, and Lila could not quite believe that this spacious, comfortable house was hers. It was a far cry from the single room she had first entered during the storm, soaked and terrified, and certain she was going to die. Now it was a home filled with love and laughter and the chaos of 5 children. Samuel grew tall and serious, taking after his father in temperament and his mother in quick intelligence. He had a gift with the horses, and Kade began teaching him the finer points of training when he was only 10. Emma remained quiet and thoughtful, a voracious reader who went through every book in the house and begged for more whenever they went to town. James was the wild one, always getting into scrapes, coming home with torn clothes and scraped knees, full of stories about the adventures he had imagined. The twins, Rose and Lily, were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and communicating in a language that seemed to consist half of words and half of glances and gestures that only they understood. On a warm summer evening when Lila was 36 and Kade 41, they sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Samuel was teaching Emma to throw a rope, while James climbed a tree to see if he could spot White River in the distance. The twins sat in the grass making chains out of wildflowers, their heads bent together, whispering and giggling. We did good, Kade said quietly. Look at them. We made good humans. Lila smiled. We did. They are going to be fine people when they grow up. Because of you, Kade said. You taught them kindness and courage. You made this house a home. We did it together, Lila corrected. Everything we have, we built together. Kade took her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. I never told you this, but the day I found you in that storm, I had been thinking about leaving, selling the ranch and moving on, going somewhere new where I could start over again. I had convinced myself that I had failed at making a life here, that being alone was just another kind of failure. Lila turned to look at him, surprised. You never said anything. Because you changed everything, Kade said. The moment I saw you in that wagon, fighting to control those horses, refusing to give up even though you were terrified, I knew. I knew you were someone special, someone worth knowing. And then when you stayed, when you chose this life, chose me, it was like the world tilted on its axis and suddenly everything made sense. I felt the same way, Lila confessed. When you lifted me down from that wagon and I looked into your eyes, something in me just knew. This was where I was supposed to be. You were who I was supposed to be with. It was terrifying and exhilarating and absolutely certain all at the same time. 15 years, Kade said wonderingly. 15 years since that storm. It feels like both a lifetime and no time at all. The best 15 years of my life, Lila said firmly. And there are so many more to come. They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, and Lila felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. This life they had built together, born from a chance encounter during a terrible storm, had grown into something beautiful and strong and enduring. The children grew and changed with the seasons. Samuel, at 16, was nearly as tall as his father and could handle the wildest horses with calm competence. He had his father's steady nature and his mother's quick mind, and Lila knew he would take over the ranch someday and run it well. Emma, at 14, had developed a passion for teaching and spent her spare time tutoring the younger children of the ranch hands and neighboring homesteaders. James, 12, was still wild but channeling his energy into useful pursuits, helping with the heavy work around the ranch and dreaming of someday exploring the mountains to the west. The twins, now 10, had developed distinct personalities despite their identical appearances. Rose was bold and adventurous, while Lily was gentle and artistic, always drawing pictures or making things with her hands. Life continued its steady rhythm, marked by births and deaths, by good years and hard ones, by the endless cycle of seasons on the Wyoming prairie. Daniel and Claire had 3 more children, and Joseph and Anna had 2. The ranch expanded to encompass nearly 1,000 acres, employing a half-dozen hands and their families. What had started as Kade's solitary existence had become a thriving community, all centered around the stone house built into the hillside. The house where Lila had first found shelter from the storm. When Lila was 40, she received a letter from California, forwarded through multiple addresses before finally reaching her. It was from her brother's widow, informing her that her brother had died the previous year from influenza. The letter included a photograph of his family, 4 children Lila had never met, and an invitation to visit if she ever found herself in California. Lila showed the letter to Kade that evening, and they talked about whether they should make the journey, take the children to meet their cousins. But in the end, they decided that their life was here, in Wyoming, on this land they had built together. Lila wrote back to her sister-in-law expressing her condolences and her regrets, but explaining that her family was here now, her roots dug deep into the Wyoming soil. On their 20th anniversary, Kade surprised Lila with a trip to Cheyenne, leaving the ranch in Samuel's capable hands for a week. It was the first time they had been away from the children for more than a day, and Lila felt both guilty and giddy with freedom. They stayed in a real hotel with indoor plumbing and ate in restaurants where other people did the cooking. They went to the theater and saw a Shakespeare play, and Lila cried at the beauty of it. They walked through the city streets hand in hand like young sweethearts, marveling at the electric lights that were starting to appear, at the modern conveniences that seemed like magic. But by the end of the week, they were both homesick and eager to return to the ranch, to their children and their land and the life they had built. The city was exciting, but it was not home. Home was the stone house on the prairie, where wildflowers grew and horses grazed and their children grew tall and strong. The years continued to pass, bringing changes both large and small. The railroad finally came to White River, connecting the small town to the wider world. Samuel married a young woman from town, a schoolteacher named Grace, and brought her home to the ranch. Kade and Daniel built them a house on the eastern edge of the property, a wedding gift. Emma left for college in the East, determined to get a formal education so she could come back and start a proper school in White River. James joined the army, following in his father's footsteps, despite Kade's mixed feelings about it. The twins stayed close to home, both marrying local boys and settling on parcels of land that Kade carved out of the ranch for them. And through it all, Kade and Lila remained the center, the foundation on which everything else was built. They grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces lining with age and experience. But their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger and deeper, tempered by time and tested by hardship, proven true again and again. When they were both in their 60s, Kade's war injuries finally caught up with him in a serious way. His back, which had troubled him for years, became so painful that he could no longer ride or do heavy work. It was a blow to a man who had defined himself by his physical capability, and Lila watched him struggle with the limitations age and injury imposed. But Samuel stepped up, taking over the day-to-day running of the ranch with quiet competence. And Kade found new ways to contribute, using his lifetime of knowledge to advise and teach the younger generation. He spent hours with his grandchildren, telling them stories about breaking horses and surviving the frontier, about the war and the years after, about the storm that had brought their grandmother to him. Lila, too, found new purpose in her older years. She became the matriarch of their expanding family, the wise woman that daughters and daughters-in-law came to for advice. She helped with the births of her grandchildren, passing on the knowledge she had gained over decades. She taught the girls to sew and garden, the boys to read and write. She kept the family stories alive, making sure each new generation knew where they came from and what their ancestors had endured to build this life. One evening, sitting on the porch they had sat on countless times before, Kade turned to Lila and said, "I have been thinking about writing it all down." "Writing what down?" Lila asked. "Our story. How we met, how we built this life. I want the grandchildren and great-grandchildren to know. I want them to understand that none of this was inevitable. It all came from one choice, one moment when I decided to ride out into a storm instead of staying safe inside. And one moment when I decided to stay instead of moving on," Lila added. "Yes," Kade agreed. All of this, 3 generations of family, the ranch, the community, all of it came from those 2 choices. That seems worth remembering. So Kade began to write, his hand cramped and slow but determined. He filled page after page with their story, starting with the storm and continuing through all the years that followed. Lila helped, filling in details he had forgotten, correcting his timeline when he got dates mixed up. It took them months, but eventually they had a full account, a testament to a life built on love and hard work and the courage to choose hope over fear. They made copies for each of their children and read the story aloud to the grandchildren, who sat wide-eyed and amazed that their ordinary grandparents had lived such an extraordinary adventure. And Lila, listening to Kade read in his rough, aged voice, felt tears slide down her cheeks as she remembered that young woman in the storm, so certain she was going to die, so unable to imagine the future that awaited her. Kade died in his sleep on a winter night when he was 72, his heart simply giving out after a lifetime of hard use. Lila woke to find him cold beside her, and the grief that hit her was like a physical blow. She had known this day would come, had tried to prepare herself for it, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of losing the man who had been her partner, her love, her whole life for 40 years. The funeral was attended by over 100 people, family and friends and people from all over the territory who had known Kade or bought horses from him, or simply heard stories about the quiet man who could gentle the wildest Mustang. They buried him on the rise overlooking his land, near the grave of Lila's uncle, where wildflowers would bloom each spring. Lila thought she might die of grief in the weeks that followed, the house too empty, too quiet, even filled with concerned children and grandchildren hovering around her. But slowly, she found her way back to living. She took comfort in her family, in the continuation of the life she and Kade had built. She found purpose in maintaining their legacy, making sure the ranch continued to prosper under Samuel's leadership, making sure the family stayed close and connected. She lived another 12 years, long enough to see great-grandchildren born, long enough to watch Emma return from the East with her degree and start the school she had dreamed of, long enough to see James come home from the army whole and healthy and marry the daughter of the minister in White River. She lived to see the new century turn, to marvel at automobiles and telephones and all the changes sweeping through even their remote corner of Wyoming. But in all those years, not a day passed when she did not think of Kade, when she did not miss him with an ache that never quite faded. She visited his grave regularly, sitting on a bench Samuel had built there, talking to him about the children and grandchildren, about the ranch, about all the small happenings of daily life. She wore the simple gold wedding band he had given her until the day she died, and she never considered removing it. When Lila died in her sleep at 84, surrounded by 3 generations of family, there was grief, but also a sense of rightness. She had lived a full life, a good life, a life rich with love and purpose. They buried her next to Kade on the rise, under a sky so blue it seemed to go on forever, and the entire community came to pay their respects to the woman who had helped build White River from a tiny outpost into a thriving town. Samuel stood at his mother's grave with his own children and grandchildren around him, and he thought about the story his parents had written, about the storm and the choice to stay, and all the years that had followed. He thought about how different his life would have been if that storm had never happened, if his mother had made it safely to White River and continued on to California, if his father had stayed alone in his house and let her pass by. But the storm had happened and the choices had been made, and from those choices had sprung everything that mattered. 3 generations of Rourkes, all descended from a chance meeting during a terrible storm, a thriving ranch that employed dozens of families, a community that took care of its own, a legacy of love and hard work, and the courage to choose hope over fear. And it had all started with 2 people brave enough to save each other, a cowboy who rode out into the storm instead of staying safe inside, and a woman who chose to stay instead of moving on, who saw in a broken soldier not someone beyond saving but someone worth loving. Together they had built something beautiful and enduring, something that would outlast them both and continue on through their children and children's children, a testament to the transformative power of love and the miracle of 2 souls finding each other in the vastness of the frontier. The wildflowers bloomed that spring, covering the rise where Lila and Kade lay side by side, and they bloomed every spring thereafter, brilliant splashes of color against the endless Wyoming sky, a reminder that from the darkest storms can come the greatest blessings, and that a life fully lived in love is the greatest legacy anyone can leave behind.